Hello and welcome to MEELive. Join us as we take another look at the news that is shaping our world.
We are broadcasting live to YouTube from Middle East Eye's headquarters here in London.
I'm Mohammed Hassan.
And I'm Matilda Mallinson. Today is Thursday, the 29th of April. Tuesday. It is Tuesday, the 29th of April.
Well, my first question to you, Matilda, was do you know what day it is today?
Evidently not. Tuesday, the 29th of April.
It is also the 100-day mark for Trump's second term in office.
Only 100 days.
Yeah, it might have felt like years.
100 years.
Yes, exactly. But that's because I think everybody has a certain level of whiplash from what has been a very dramatic 3 months. We're going to be taking a look at all of that, everything that has happened over the last 3 months, and more importantly, what it's meant for the world. We're going to be joined over Zoom by our fantastic U.S. reporter, Sean Matthews. He's going to be telling us everything about how Trump's policies have impacted the world, and then we're going to be joined in studio by our equally fantastic presenter, Mohammed Hashim. He's going to be telling us about the dramatic Canadian election result that we saw this morning.
Mm-hmm. And the show does not end there. After that, we'll be turning to Gaza, which has not seen the peace that Trump promised when he came into power, and instead is experiencing now over 50 days of an aid blockade. Now, this aid blockade caused controversy in terms of international law, and so it's seen headlines for that. But what we haven't seen much of is the impact on the ground, where there is now an inevitable starvation crisis in Gaza. So we will be speaking to our correspondent in the enclave, Maha Husseini, about what it looks like on the ground and how she herself is navigating it.
The big show ahead. Please stay tuned. First, let's take a look at the headlines.
Israel stands trial for a second day at the International Court of Justice. The hearing looks at Israel's obligations towards international bodies in occupied Palestine after Israel banned UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, in October. It is the third ICJ hearing into Israeli violations of international law since 2004, and it comes amid widespread starvation in Gaza, which we will be looking into later on the show. Riyad Mansour, the Palestinian ambassador to the UN, told reporters outside The Hague that justice is about more than aid. Our reporter, Sondos Asim, was on site.
We need to see the end of this illegal occupation. We need to see the implementation of the two-state solution to become a reality and to allow the Palestinian people to live in freedom and dignity in our land, which we love immensely, Palestine. And we will do that. Thank you.
Cross-border gunfire, the demolition of suspects' homes, and clashes between diaspora populations overseas. Tensions are escalating between India and Pakistan following the deadly April 22nd attack in Kashmir, in which 26 people were killed by an armed group, 25 of them Indian tourists. It was the deadliest civilian attack in decades in the disputed territory, over which the nuclear-armed rivals have fought 3 wars. India has accused Pakistan of supporting the militants and withdrawn from a vital water-sharing treaty. Pakistan denies involvement and says any attempt to divert its water source will be taken as an act of war.
Now, at least 68 people have been killed and 47 wounded after US airstrikes in Yemen struck a migrant detention center on Monday. The victims came from several African countries and were detained while crossing to Yemen in a bid to seek work in Saudi Arabia. It marks the deadliest attack since Donald Trump launched an airstrike campaign against the Houthis last month. In response, the group has vowed to continue its attack in the Red Sea and Arabian Sea.
Meanwhile, the number of casualties from Saturday's port explosion in Iran has now surpassed 70 people. MEE received footage from the site in Bandar Abbas, a site that CNN reported in February had received hundreds of tons of chemicals from China to fuel Iran's ballistic missile program. Tehran has denied links to missile fuel and instead blames the explosion on a failure to observe safety principles at the site. Over 1,000 people were reportedly wounded by the blast.
And finally, officials for former US President Joe Biden have admitted the Democratic leader never once pressured Israel for a ceasefire, even as Gaza's death toll passed 30,000, an investigation by Israeli Channel 13 has revealed. This revelation about US complicity comes as Amnesty International accuses current US President Donald Trump of directly causing a global human rights crisis. The international NGO's annual report warns of creeping authoritarianism and the annihilation of international law in the 100 days since Trump resumed leadership. Next up, we examine those 100 days more closely and ask what they've meant for the Middle East and the world.
This is MEELive's Deep Dive, where we dive into a story shaking up the world. And nothing has shaken the world more than the last 100 days of Donald Trump's chaotic and monumental second term in office.
The golden age of America begins right now. My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day, and the day that we began to make America wealthy again. Let's be honest. The European Union was formed in order to screw the United States. That's the purpose of it. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. Right now, you don't. You're playing cards. You're gambling with World War III. I don't want to be cute. I don't want to be a wise guy, but the Riviera of the Middle East, this could be something that could be so bad. This could be so magnificent. Very anti-Semitic when you take a look, whether it's Columbia, Harvard, Princeton. I don't know what's going on. We need Greenland for national security and even international security. And I think we're going to get it. One way or the other, we're going to get it.
US President Donald Trump was elected on a platform of making America great again, and making the rest of the world pay their respects and their tariffs. In just 3 months, he threatened to annex Gaza, Greenland, the Panama Canal, and Canada. He promised to bring peace to Europe and the Middle East, though both regions now appear more uncertain than ever. Under his watch, hundreds of migrants, some with legal status in the US, were arrested and deported to prison camps in El Salvador. At least 4 pro-Palestinian students are now in detention, including green card holders Mahmoud Khalil and Mohsen Mahdawi. Thousands of others have had their visas revoked or live in fear that they'll be targeted by masked ICE agents for taking part in protests. Trump tore up DEI initiatives and bullied Ivy League schools into letting his administration take control of their campuses and their curriculums. Now he's being sued by Harvard, the world's richest university. Meanwhile, his political partner and financier Elon Musk is bulldozing his way inside the government. His Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, fired hundreds of thousands of public sector workers, downsizing the departments of education, the environment, tax, and social services. Not to mention gutting USAID, denying billions in foreign aid to dozens of developing countries, NGOs, and human rights organizations. And then came the tariffs. First targeting the US's strongest trade partners, Canada and Mexico, then the rest of the world. They sent the stock market into a tailspin and made some of Trump's friends billions of dollars when they were suddenly reversed. The White House says it's all part of an elaborate strategy to reform global trade and claw back manufacturing jobs from China. But what we're now faced with is a full-on trade war between the world's 2 biggest economies, threatening global recession and rewriting political and economic alliances around the world. In his first term in office, what held Trump back was his own party, his own cabinet, formed from technocrats like oil magnate Rex Tillerson and lifelong Republicans like his VP Mike Pence. He then fired Tillerson and looked the other way when his most favored supporters threatened to kill Pence as they stormed Capitol Hill in an attempt to overturn a Democratic election in 2020. This time, though, there is no one standing up to Trump. He's surrounded by people praising his every move, applauding him in every room he steps into. His former political rivals like Marco Rubio have bent the knee and been rewarded for it. The judges that have tried to keep him in check have either been ignored or arrested. His party has been reshaped in his image, and MAGA is now a political storm that will dominate the Republicans and the country for generations. Trump wants to fundamentally redefine the US and its role in the world. So how has the world responded? To break it down for us, we're joined now live from Athens by MEE political reporter Sean Matthews. Sean, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me on, Mo. It's a pleasure to join you.
Now, Trump campaigned on being a peacemaker. He said he was going to end all wars, and he promised especially to resolve the situation in Ukraine and Gaza. How is that going so far?
Yeah, I think he's gotten smacked by the geopolitical realities, probably both domestic and international with both wars. We should separate Gaza and Ukraine, but let's take Ukraine at first, right? Trump set himself a high bar with Ukraine. He said he would end the war in 1 day upon taking office. So we're at 100 days. No deal has been sealed. You played those clips when I joined earlier, kind of about Trump's 100 days. And we heard the browbeating of Zelensky in the White House, that famous line where he says, you have no cards. A lot of supporters of Ukraine believe that Trump has been obviously harder on Ukraine than he has been on Russia, Russia being the United States' historic geopolitical foe, both in the Middle East and in Europe. He's failed at that. I think with Ukraine, the big hiccup here is that Trump really has to ask himself whether Putin wants to end the war or not. Trump came out and he gave into some of Putin's key demands actually already, which a lot of critics of Trump have said kind of played into Russia, right? He said that Ukraine was going to be off the table from joining NATO. He says now that he wants to recognize Russia's annexation of Crimea, something that European states and even Turkey, a NATO member, are opposed to. So, he's given some big cards to Russia, and a lot of people are starting to say that he's gotten nothing in return. Trump had a big meeting with Zelensky at the Vatican during the Pope Francis's funeral. And around that time, Trump has started to up his criticism of Russia a little bit more. He said he was very disappointed in Putin for the missile strikes that were taking place in Kyiv. Very rare to hear Trump speak at all, whether in the Middle East or in Europe, about civilian casualties. Doesn't matter who they are. It's probably one of the first times he's actually mentioned civilian casualties. So that was kind of seen as a sign of Trump's growing frustration with the Russians. But in general, I think that this Ukraine deal is it's stuck. The big hallmark, which Trump wanted to have done within his 100 days, for sure, was this mineral deal, where Ukraine and the U.S. would agree to a joint fund to invest in strategic minerals, resources in Ukraine. Trump said that would give the Ukrainians, security guarantees because there'd be American investors on the ground, American workers. And Trump hasn't even been able to get that deal done. Now, this week, we've heard rumors that the deal could be sealed by this week. So I think in European capitals and in Washington, everyone is watching that. On the Middle East front, I think it's even more of a bad score for Trump. The Gaza war is raging. And Trump has pretty much let it go unchecked. Before he came into office in January, he made a big push to get a ceasefire sealed for his inauguration. And he very much wanted the optics of being a deal maker at that time on January 20th, to have the images of the guns going silent in Israel, and probably most importantly for Trump, hostages being taken out of Gaza and sent back to Israel, even to Europe and the US. And he got that deal done. Once the initial exchange was over, Trump basically gave Netanyahu a green light to go back into Gaza and to restart his war. And that's where we're at today. I would say this: everyone is focusing on Gaza and Ukraine, but I was listening to your headlines earlier, and not only has Trump failed to end those two wars, but he has got America into another conflict in Yemen in his 100 days. So we have daily bombing campaigns from U.S. warplanes over Yemen as the U.S. tries to wrest back control of the Red Sea. Its claim to stop Houthi attacks there. So I think he's 0 for 2, and he's actually batting a negative in terms of ending the wars.
And let's get to the Middle East in a second, but going back to Europe and this relationship that Europe has enjoyed with the U.S. for a very long time under the NATO agreement, which was this bulwark designed to keep Russia at bay, Europe was able to shift its focus away from militarization and towards progressive economic policies that a lot of European countries, are the envy of the world. And in exchange, it had this promise from the U.S. that if any military aggression, specifically from Russia, would come into place, then the U.S. would come and protect them. And we saw that under Biden when the Ukraine war started. But now we're seeing this very, very dramatic shift under Trump. what is happening to Europe? How is it reacting to this sudden antagonism that they're seeing from their once ally in the US?
Yeah, Mo, it's really fascinating to see, especially on the periphery of Europe, in Eastern Europe, in the Balkans. You really see these countries, I guess, becoming more aware that they're a part of Eurasia, right? And that they can no longer rely on this American Western security umbrella. Europe wanted guns. The argument has always been guns or butter, and Europe took the butter and it left the guns to the US. So now Europe is rearming. We're seeing this push from countries like Germany to reinvest in their armaments industry, even to repurpose factories that were geared towards automotive vehicles into weapons factories. As Germany kind of loses out in China with the vehicle race. So there is a lot of talk about manufacturing weapons in Europe. It remains to be seen whether the Europeans have the capabilities to do that, because they're constrained by, first, labor shortages, aging populations, high energy costs, massively more expensive than the U.S., and it takes a lot of energy to manufacture weapons and missiles. So I think the Europeans are struggling with rearmament, but they are committing themselves to that. We saw Spain, which has always been a laggard in NATO spending, come out and say it was going to reach 2% of defense spending. But the really big pushes have been in Eastern Europe and in Southern Europe, Southeastern Europe, I would say, where countries are more proximate to age-old foes. In Greece's case, Turkey. In the case of Poland, Russia. These countries are really leading the pack in investing more in defense, going above the 2% kind of metrics of the GDPs that NATO requires them to invest. They're at 4%, 3%, and they're going to go higher. So there is a rearmament push going on. And I think Europe basically faces a conundrum, right? Which is that either you raise taxes to keep sustaining a welfare state and military spending, or you cut the welfare state and don't raise taxes. And that's the problem that Europe faces right now. I would say this, though, before we get to the U.S., it is interesting. You talked about mega movement. The idea in Europe that is gaining some traction is that, as the U.S. kind of fractures, that we could see a mega movement, which is make Europe great again. That's the rhetoric that some Europeans use. Because we're seeing kind of some liberally minded Americans want to move to Europe to escape Trump and this kind of stuff. But it's the defense spending, and it's this idea that Europe could be more of a haven of stability. We've seen the euro rising against the dollar, so there's a lot of talk in the geoeconomic sphere that Europe might replace the US dollar system. That's another conversation. But there is a trend where you see Europe coalescing a bit. I would just say this. I think that the most interesting trend for the Middle East is there are two countries that are perhaps best placed to benefit from this European drive of an American vacuum being left. One is Turkey, which has the largest military standing army in NATO. It's a huge defense manufacturer, obviously, in drones. We've reported on this for many years. It's a great story that Middle East Eye has been on top of. Then the other story, despite the war that is raging in Gaza, is Israel. And Israel is looking to increase co-production and joint production with specific countries in Eastern Europe where it has alliances. I'm thinking about Greece as one, but also I would look for Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. These countries have cheap labor costs. They are spending high amounts of their GDP on defense, and they are looking to buy Israeli products, which is a very interesting trend. At the same time that Israel is taking money from the U.S., of course, the military aid.
Now, speaking of armament, another massive project for Trump right now seems to be getting a new Iran nuclear deal on the table. And of course, back in his first term, he was the one that walked away from that initial nuclear deal that was organized under the Obama administration that allowed Iran to escape some of the brutal sanctions that had crippled its economy. Now there's this back and forth happening between Trump and Iran. The language itself is really interesting because Trump seems to be saying that we can get this deal done. We don't have to escalate. But at the same time, I have this military solution on the table. And this is a military solution that some of the strongest people in his ear really want to explore. What do you think is at stake here with these talks that have already started between the U.S. and Iran?
Yeah, Look, Mo, I would say this. During the campaign in November when we were covering this race, there were three open files that Trump had to address in foreign policy. One was Ukraine, the other was Gaza, and then the other was this Iranian nuclear deal. I think the irony for Trump is that the Ukrainians, which are receiving all this American weaponry aid, and Putin, which Trump has this fondness for, they're not delivering for Trump. Israel, America's closest ally, is not going to deliver on ending the war in Gaza. It is actually Iran, that might deliver for Trump the deal that he needs to show that he is a deal maker and that he can get something done. And it's ironic because if you remember, as you said, in Trump's first term, he really cracked down on Iran. He assassinated Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the IRGC Quds Force. He ramped up this maximum pressure campaign. But with the Iranians, from our reporting and from sources we speak with, diplomats in the region, analysts, even U.S. officials, there is a sense that Iran desperately wants a deal. Its economy is not doing well. There's a lot of pressure from Gulf states for there to be a deal. I think this is very important, and we should emphasize this more, that Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, they desperately want to see a deal between the U.S. and Iran. Israel doesn't, but these countries do. We saw the Saudi defense minister, Khalid bin Salman, MBS's brother, going to Iran this month. That was a very big visit. So I think Trump could potentially get a deal with Iran. The problem is that Trump's team is divided in two, and I think this is what people have to understand. There is the traditional hawkish kind of Republican wing represented by guys like Marco Rubio, also, Mike Waltz, his national security advisor, and they are very hard on Iran, right? These are your traditional Republicans, right? When you think of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, that's who you think of. At the other side, you have isolationist, American first Republicans who are extremely reluctant to enter a conflict with Iran, and they have been really increasing their voice, demanding a deal with Iran. Within the administration, that's represented by J.D. Vance, the vice president. Vance took a lot of heat for browbeating Zelensky in the Oval Office. But Vance consistently is showing up as this guy who is the most isolationist in Trump's wing. He opposed the strikes in Yemen during the Signalgate chat. Everyone had visibility into that. Vance kind of arguing that this, striking the Houthis in Yemen was not in keeping with Trump's kind of campaign in November of America First. I don't think he did it because he cared about Yemen, but at least for his perceptive and his worldview, he wanted to see the U.S. kind of pulling back from entanglements. So he is a big voice for a deal. Tulsi Gabbard, also Trump's director of national intelligence, she came out at a Senate hearing and she very firmly said that the U.S. intelligence community assesses that Iran has not decided to make a nuclear weapon. And that was a very big statement from her because it gave a lot of ammunition to Trump allies in the media to come out and say, look, our own intelligence community is saying that Iran has not decided to build a nuclear bomb. They have not crossed that threshold. They're not even contemplating it yet. So don't underestimate that statement also from Gabbard. So Trump has these two wings pulling at him, right, at the same time. And I think a lot of people think that Trump is probably leaning towards the isolationist America First view. We did a piece yesterday for Middle East Eye discussing kind of the conservative podcasters who are really, really hammering the need for a deal. Tucker Carlson is the main one, who has really unfettered access to the Trump administration. He has, almost every month he has had a different podcast on talking about why a war with Iran would be a disaster for the U.S. And yesterday Trump came out and said he thought he could get a deal with Iran. I know we want to talk about Trump's visit also, but I would say this. I think a hallmark to look for, let's see what happens in middle of May when Trump goes to the region. Because I think Trump very, very much would like to unveil a nuclear deal then. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I think the Iranians have serious reservations about working with Trump, whether they can trust them or not. As you said, right, Trump unilaterally withdrew from the 2015 nuclear deal. But I think that out of the three kind of conflicts that we've discussed, these files that are raging, Gaza, Ukraine, and Iran, it's actually with Iran that Trump probably has the best chance of striking a deal.
Well, let's end our conversation on this upcoming Trump visit to the Middle East. Of course, as you rightly mentioned, I'm sure that he will want to land with a red carpet rolled in front of him as this peacemaker that's going into the region and bringing it together. But looking at the policies, and when it comes to tariffs, when it comes to his policy in Gaza, when it comes to the way that he's handled that situation, those negotiations between several of the countries that are involved in the hostage negotiations in Gaza with Hamas, for example, is Trump going to land in the Middle East as this peacemaker, as somebody that, in his first term was embraced by a lot of the leaders in the region, or is he landing as somebody that has caused a lot of these same leaders more headaches than they had bargained for?
Well, I guess it depends where he's landing, Mo. He's going to three countries, at least publicly, right? Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. I think in the UAE, he's going to get a warm reception. The UAE has really doubled down on its partnership with Israel through the Abraham Accords. They've kind of ignored, they just want to wish away the war in Gaza. That is what the UAE wants. We've even reported ourselves that the UAE has been lobbying the Trump administration not to agree to an Arab League plan for the post-war reconstruction of Gaza. So I think in the UAE, Trump will probably have a fine welcome. In Qatar, I think, Trump's a deal maker, and he's very, he is comfortable, kind of working with the Qataris. Steve Witkoff, his envoy, has been full of praise for Qatar's role as an envoy in the Gaza negotiations. But I really think the big country here, Mo, that we have to watch, it's Saudi Arabia, obviously. I mean, this is the big one. What Trump desperately wants is to expand the Abraham Accords, which he considers the hallmark of his presidency, his first term. And he needs Saudi Arabia to do that. Trump might not care about the war in Gaza, but Mohammed bin Salman has to care about the war in Gaza because his people very much care about the war. And the Crown Prince has publicly said that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza. So Trump's main mission during his trip to the region, after nuclear deal with Iran, if he wants it, is the Abraham Accords. And it's to convince Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to normalize ties with Israel. I suspect, and diplomats that I speak with in the region, U.S. analysts, officials, everyone is very, very skeptical that the Crown Prince is going to make a normalization deal while a war is raging in Gaza, and most of the Arab and Muslim world considers a genocide is going on. So I think he's got his work cut out for him in Saudi Arabia.
Sean Matthews, it's a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks, Mohammed.
And you can read Sean's excellent reporting on Trump and the Middle East by going to our website, middleeasti.net. And if we wanted proof of how the world is responding to Trump, then look no further than the resounding answer we got this morning from just across the US border. Canadians voted to keep the Liberals in power in a stunning turnaround for a government that just months ago faced widespread opposition. Following the resignation of former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau just 1 month ago, most estimates predicted the end of his decade-long era of pro-immigrant and anti-Trump politics. But this morning, the Liberals were voted back into power, buoyed by a renewed sense of national pride, outraged by Trump's thinly veiled threats against his former ally. Canada's new Prime Minister, economist and former central bank governor Mark Carney made this stance very clear.
When I sit down with President Trump, it will be to discuss the future economic and security relationship between two sovereign nations. And it will be with our full knowledge that we have many, many other options than the United States to build prosperity for all Canadians. We will chart a new path forward, because this is Canada and we decide what happens here.
Now, to tell us more about Canada's election result, we're joined by MEE presenter Mohammed Hashim. Mohammed, welcome to the studio.
Hey, Mohammed, how are you?
Good. It's good to meet you, Mohammed.
It's good to be here. You guys have a nice setup here.
Oh, thank you very much.
It.
Yeah, thank you. This is totally new.
Yeah. No, you guys are doing magic.
We're trying. So tell us about this morning. We woke up to news that I think a lot of Canadians were excited by, that they didn't expect to happen. What is the mood coming into a massive election result like this?
I mean, look, it was a remarkable election nonetheless. It depends, obviously, the mood depends on who you're speaking to in Canada, but it is a remarkable election in the sense that it was really a two-party race. We have we have a multi-party system in Canada, but I think with this election, it really fell down to the Liberals and the Conservatives. Both parties have won 40% or more than 40% of the popular vote, which hasn't happened in 100 years. So it's, again, that just shows how significant it was.
Because Canada's a multi-party political system, essentially, right?
Yes, multi-party parliamentary system. Yeah, and the Liberals have won the election. It's still not called yet whether it's going to be a minority or a majority government. It's being said right now that it is a minority because they've won 168 out of 172 seats. If they are able to flip 4 more seats, they will win a majority. And that is because the overseas ballots still haven't been counted. So they're still in the process of doing that. We'll probably find out by the end of today, maybe tomorrow, if they do have a majority government. But Mark Carney has won. He is the new he has been the Prime Minister of Canada, but he now officially has won a term as the Prime Minister. And the Conservatives lost, yeah. And Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party, has actually lost his seat. So it's remarkable in that sense. And
because this wasn't supposed to happen, right? If like a couple of months ago, you looked at the polls, the Liberals were being decimated. It got so bad that Justin Trudeau had to essentially resign in disgrace in an attempt to try and keep his party from falling apart, not even just winning the election. And Pierre Poilievre, as you said, was coming in as this almost like a surefire win to come into and become the next prime minister. What happened?
Well, what happened is this election has been fundamentally shaped by the threat of annexation by Canada's neighbor to the south, so the United States under Donald Trump. And essentially, it just became a referendum on, or maybe not a referendum, but a political choice between who can actually stand up to Trump the most. And if we're taking the results, it's Canadians thought that Carney is probably best suited to stand up to these threats by Donald Trump. And that's what we saw.
And they really took this seriously, like this idea that Canada was going to become the 51st state. We heard Trump say it initially. I think people thought it was a joke or kind of an offhanded remark. And then he doubled down on it and he kept repeating it. And I think things got particularly heated between him and Trudeau during those tariff negotiations. And we heard him again repeating this statement that Canada should become part of America and that America should absorb it into its federacy. How did Canadians react to something like that? I mean, was it taken seriously at first?
I mean, I think the repetition made it a lot more serious. I think the fact that even Trudeau himself has started talking about that this guy is being serious in what he's saying made Canadians realize what's at stake. But also the fact that Trump doubled down with the tariffs and the trade war that he basically initiated with Canada made it a much more serious race to begin with. And honestly, look, I was recently on a trip to Halifax not long ago, and I've started seeing this strong sense of nationalism that I haven't seen before. And I think even the culture in the country has kind of started to shift to reject this Trumpian notion, if you will. Been seeing a lot more flags than usual. Even if you walk into the supermarkets, you start seeing these little notes saying "Buy Canadian," or they start identifying which products are Canadian so you can buy them. And I've never really seen, just not me, but I think we've never really seen that wave of nationalism kind of take over Canada the way it has because of what Trump has been saying. And also, in another sense of to why the Conservatives may have lost the vote, is because the Conservatives were leaning on a lot of the populist tendencies that Trump himself was kind of aligning himself with. Poilievre was basically saying that he's going to cut taxes, he's going to cut foreign aid, he's going to shorten government spending. He's going to defund the public broadcaster. So it's a lot of populist policies that many Trump supporters would have agreed with. And so when Trump came back and started lashing out and started talking about making Canada 51st state, talking about the tariffs and all that, Poilievre found himself that he's had just a tiny, not a lot of room to kind of pivot. And so what Carney capitalized on is the fact that the Conservatives didn't really have enough time to shift gear, and their political messaging was basically falling apart in that particular regard.
What's interesting about Justin Trudeau, the former prime minister, and Donald Trump is that they almost started their careers at the same time. They were often compared to each other. Back in 2017, when Trump took office, Justin Trudeau really shaped himself as a kind of foil to Trump. He was liberal, he was pro-immigration, he was pro-LGBT, he was very open, he was a globalist in a lot of ways. And Trump has always kind of been seen as kind of the opposite of that. And now that you have this election, again, off the back of this threat from Trump, are we expecting to see Mark Carney become what Justin Trudeau was in 2017? Will he be that same kind of leader?
Well, you know what's funny about that is that in 2015, when Trudeau won, and then Trump came in not long after, I think, like you said, 2017 that Trump, or was it 2016? Just anyway, when Trump was sworn in after that, the biggest question at the time was, how is Trudeau gonna deal with the Trump handshake? I think that was like the conversation that was taking part. Now you look at Trump 2.0 and the conversation in Canada, it's a totally different thing because of what's at stake. I think Carney did already present himself as a man of change, and it's from the election results, it seemed that Canadians have accepted that kind of change, in the sense that he's not the same politician that Trudeau was. He presents himself much more of a technocrat, much more of a political outsider. He's already buried the carbon tax, which was a central tenet of Trudeau's platform, and it was very unpopular. So Carney has already said that he's not going to follow through with that. He's going to keep the immigration cap that Trudeau announced at the final months of his tenureship. So that kind of change has already been presented. Whether it's a lot or too much or too little, Canadians have already accepted that this is the change that we want to see.
And you're seeing this rise of Canadian nationalism now in opposition to the U.S. What does that look like? How are Canadians expressing their newfound sense of national unity?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I've seen a lot more flags being displayed on the streets, in people's houses, on cars. The thing I mentioned about supermarkets, even in popular culture, like there's commercials, there's a new song that a song that they remade and put out with Canadian celebrities that really talks about unity and being together and whatnot. The Elbows Up campaign, which is a reference to hockey. So it's all these things that are coming up in popular culture to really kind of differentiate and push back against the rhetoric coming from the United States towards Canada.
A fascinating story. Thank you very much for illuminating it for us.
Thank you for bringing me on. I just wanted to be close to you, man. I just wanted to talk to you.
I appreciate it. I'm Ed Hashim, our MEE presenter and the host of the weekly podcast Real Talk, which you can find on YouTube and all podcast platforms. Now, stay tuned as we turn now to the devastating situation in Gaza and the ongoing blockade of aid and food and its impacts on people on the ground.
I've disconnected. Today, we are spotlighting the surge of starvation in Gaza amid an aid blockade by Israel that has been going on for more than 50 days. The blockade has emptied warehouses of food, medical supplies, shelter materials, and safe water, fueling an exploitative black market on which people rely to survive. Before the war erupted in October 2023, Gazans relied on 500 trucks a day to deliver essential provisions, but no humanitarian or commercial supplies have entered the Strip since the start of March. Collective punishment and the use of starvation as a weapon of war, these accusations underpin Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court. And at the International Court of Justice in The Hague, a trial is underway over Israel's barring of the UN's biggest aid agency in Gaza, UNRWA, whose spokesperson today called the siege on Gaza the silent killer of children and older people. While international justice takes its course, people in Gaza are suffering as aid runs out and food prices soar. Footage from the enclave shows civilians being forced to eat turtle meat to survive. Livestock has been severely impacted by the ongoing conflict, which rapidly decimated 95% of cattle and 99% of poultry in its very first month. The aid blockade, initiated on the 2nd of March, was immediately condemned by the UN and several Arab states as a violation of international law. This afternoon, I spoke to Middle East Eye's correspondent in Gaza City, Maha Husseini, about how the severity of the situation has increased since then.
Well, the crisis now, the starvation crisis particularly, is the worst now. It has developed over the past weeks, because there is no end in sight to this blockade. Israel was clear actually about using this closure of borders and the obstruction of humanitarian aid as a tool of collective punishment, not just against Hamas or Palestinian factions, but against the entire population of 2.3 million residents. People are literally, we can fairly say that people are starving now, because most families, most households rely now on one meal per day if they find this meal. And why this crisis is now worse than ever, because this is the culmination of a long-standing policy of deprivation, of starvation, of blockade. Those who managed to survive previous rounds of blockade and food obstruction, Israel has consistently and repeatedly imposed these kinds of blockade on Gaza since the beginning of October 2023. And even before October, yes, we have people here in the Gaza Strip have been living under a strangling blockade in Gaza since 2007. But this is the culmination of this policy of deprivation. People who endured previous blockades, and especially during this war in Gaza, can no longer now endure another one. Their health is simply deteriorating. Their bodies have been slowly weakened, and they're in ways that people outside of Gaza cannot actually understand. Most families now typically have canned food, if it's available, because canned food even also is running from most of households, because we're talking about 2 months of complete blockade, of aid obstruction. So they rely on what they have stocked up on in the previous weeks. Most of them also rely on rice or bread. There are no other options, because even UN and international humanitarian aid has been almost entirely suspended after their warehouses depleted. And for nearly a month now, we're talking about 25 WFP World Food Program Organization supported bakeries across the Strip have been completely shut down. These bakeries were the main source of bread for 2 million residents. They have completely shut down due to lack of wheat flour and fuel. So even bread, Gaza's last staple, and whoever came to Gaza or know Gazans knows that bread is a very main dish or staple for Palestinians in Gaza. Even bread is now increasingly unavailable. Families who still have small amounts of wheat flour that they received before the aid obstruction or aid suspension from international organization are now baking their own bread at home, using, of course, primitive and hand-made ovens that burn firewood, because there is no fuel whatsoever, of course. And this is another crisis, because people now are struggling in every aspect, every way in their lives. They cannot find anything to eat, and they cannot even find the fuel to bake anything they find.
Maha, why are people in Gaza so dependent on humanitarian aid for food? What about the food supply, the agricultural supply from within Gaza?
Yes, of course. For so many years, for the past 17 years particularly, people, around 70% of people, of course, this percentage has developed over the years, but before this war, around 70 to 80% of Palestinians in Gaza were dependent on international aid due to the blockade, of course, due to Israel's restrictions on goods entering and or into and out of Gaza. But they were able before the war to manage this situation because there were farmlands, there was a vast there were vast farmlands across Gaza. We were talking about a very high percentage of croplands that were providing for Palestinians, not only to local market, but also to international markets when the borders were open. But today, even those farmlands are unusable. The vast majority of these croplands are rendered unusable because we're talking about around 80% of these farmlands that have been completely damaged or completely destroyed or leveled by the Israeli army. Israel made it clear that they did not want any food basket for Gaza, main food basket for Gaza. So they were targeting directly these farmlands. The farmers who tried to reach to these farmlands were being sniped by Israeli snipers, or targeted or bombed by Israeli quadcopters and aircraft. And most of them were leveled, of course, burned. And the vast majority of them also were annexed to the buffer zones. Now we're talking about a large portion of Gaza's lands are now annexed to the buffer zones. Around 50% of Gaza is now a buffer zone by Israel. And most of this buffer zone was actually farmland. So we're talking about a high percent of these farmlands that are rendered unusable for this reason. Another reason, of course, is the increasing need for these farmlands to be rendered displacement camps. People are fleeing from one area to another, and most of the time, they flee to these farmlands. They actually turn them into camps, displacement camps, and of course, that when large portion or large numbers of people reach to these farmlands, we're talking about hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands, particularly in Mawasi Khan Yunis, for example, which was an area that Palestinians relied on heavily for crops and for vegetables, fruits mainly, is now unusable due to the displacement, the large number of people living there and turning these farmlands into tents, into camps for displacement. Another reason, of course, there are so many reasons. Another reason is the water contamination, which is also caused by the destruction of the infrastructure, water and agriculture infrastructure by Israel. We're talking about 70 to 85% of the water and agricultural infrastructure destroyed completely, or in ways that need years to be repaired by Israel. And of course, this damage to the infrastructure affects the water.
Thank you, Maha, for explaining that. Now, food insecurity tends to hit the most vulnerable first. From what you've seen in Gaza at the moment, who is being worst affected by this starvation crisis?
Of course, the most vulnerable groups, such as children and the elderly, are the hardest hit by this crisis. The elderly in particular, whose health is already fragile, normally require carefully balanced meals rich in vegetables and fruits to stay alive. In Gaza, of course, there are no fruits available at all, none whatsoever. There are no fruits for the past 2 months. People haven't seen that. As for the vegetables, only a few items remain. These are provided, of course, by the croplands that are still usable or accessible by farmers. So naturally, because these vegetables are so scarce, their prices are outrageously expensive. So people cannot actually buy, even if they are available in limited supplies, people cannot buy them. Because, for example, like if I can give you an example, the tomatoes, people here in Gaza used to buy 1 kilogram of tomato for around 1 to 3 shekels, which is less than $1. Today it's around 35 shekels, which is around $10. The potato is for around $13. So you can imagine that the vast majority of households here cannot simply afford these vegetables. Children also are suffering in numerous ways, particularly newborns and those in crucial stages of growth, particularly. For example, today I spoke with a Gaza resident who told me that he had taken his youngest son, his 2-year-old son, to a UN clinic that checks children for malnutrition. And he was shocked that the doctors told him that his son was severely malnourished. He said that he did not expect that because his son was not too skinny. So he did not expect that he would be suffering from malnutrition or severe malnutrition particularly. But the doctors told him that there is a form of invisible malnutrition now rampant in Gaza, where children look healthy. For example, for the first look, when you look at them or when you see them, you would say that they are healthy. They are not so skinny as you see in the television or in photos, etc., and in the media. But in reality, they suffer from severe malnutrition, and the percentage Palestinians or children here in Gaza suffer from this is very, very high. It's like a form of silent malnutrition here in Gaza that the world also cannot understand the extent to which people have reached this point, because the main dish for children now is canned food. And canned food is not a healthy meal for children, particularly. And this is all what's available. There are no options actually for their families.
Maha, and how are you coping? Not just coping, but continuing reporting for us here at Middle East Eye.
Well, much of my time is actually going through the markets, trying to find food, trying to secure what's available in the market, trying to find what's affordable. For example, in the past, for example, when the borders were open, we used to report all the time, we used to work, etc. But today, much of our time is actually only of survival, trying to survive. Only to secure fire, for example, for food, to find a source of fuel, to find food, etc. So we're trying to cope because we're part of this population that we report on. We're part of the crisis we report on, and it's very important because whenever I meet someone and for an interview, for example, to take their testimony, I can relate. When they say that they spend much of their time trying to find food, I can relate because before I met them, I was at home trying to think of alternatives for lunch, for example, before I go to work. And our thinking all the time is evolving around how to secure food, how to find alternatives, for example, for meat, for protein, for vitamins, etc. And it's a struggle. As I said before, it's a struggle in every way possible, because every aspect of our life is actually a struggle, from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to bed, in our shelters, in our camps, etc.
Maha Husseini, thank you for your reporting and thank you for joining us here at MEELive. That was Middle East Eye's Maha Husseini, whose full report you can read on our website, middleeasteye.net, or by following the link in the description below.
For now, that is all the time that we have, but before we lose you, we want to hear from you.
Please send in your thoughts. At Middle East Eye is our handle across all social media sites, and you can also email meelive@middleeasteye.net.
Make sure you tune in every Tuesday, every Thursday, 5 p.m. British Standard Time, or 12 p.m. if you're in New York.
See you then.